So welcome everyone to our webinar today. I would like to welcome my colleague, David Robinson. He is the conservation advocate here at Tucson Audubon, and he's going to be talking about his recent trip to Ecuador, where he was volunteering. And he saw some pretty awesome birds, and I hope we're going to get to see some photos as well. So I will turn it over to David now and let him introduce himself and give us a little bit of information on the agenda and what we're going to talk about today. So go ahead, David.
Thank you, Kirsten, and hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this. The agenda is I am going to first tell you about the project that I was part of, the volunteering project I was part of. And then I will turn to some of the highlights in terms of the birds I saw and managed to get photos of. And then we'll have time for questions and answers, and also hopefully a little bit of reflection on some of what I learned aside from the skills I was there to learn. About mist netting and bird banding and all. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and hope that the gods of technology smile on us. All right.
It looks good, David.
Okay, and I'm going to hit play and see if this works. Okay, so far so good. All right. So, even though this is about my trip to Ecuador, Costa Rica is what really started all of this. About 4 years ago, I went on my first tropical birding trip. I went alone to Costa Rica and went birding with some local guides and was just blown away. And so I saved up, in the following year, I went back and did some birding, but I also wanted to give back. I wanted to help protect this the habitats and the birds that I was so amazed by. And so I volunteered for a few days at an ornithological research station at Bihagual Ecological Reserve. I helped an ornithologist there. He was bird banding, and I assisted by recording the information that he would read aloud to me or speak aloud to me. But he did teach me how to hold a bird, or at least a small songbird. I got to hold, in this case, the most thrilling one was a red-capped manakin male. It actually was a very rainy day, and once I released it, it flew to a houseplant at the side of the deck, and that's what the picture is, the close-up, and it sat there for about a half hour and then flew off. I, however, was in seventh heaven, and that lasted till way after I got home, and I was hooked. So I decided I had to get more involved with bird banding and mist netting and all. So I did a little Googling and came across a project in Ecuador at a small private reserve, Reserva las Tangaras, which means the Tanagers Reserve, and arranged to go for a 2-week volunteer project in July of 2020. But the pandemic came along, and so that got put on hold and eventually rescheduled for December of 2021. And so on December 3rd, I flew to Quito, and a few days later, I was there at the entrance to Reserva las Tangaras. And then I was with our whole team, which consisted of 8 volunteers, including me, the lead researcher, Dr. Dusty Becker, 4 Ecuadorian staff who've been working with Dusty for the past 20 years, and a couple of American grad students, a young married couple who were living and working at the reserve as caretakers and also research assistants and conducting some of their own research. So a little bit of background. Reserva Las Tangaras is, you can see its location in the Northwest. Just note, the map is not drawn to scale. It's a very small reserve, but that gives you the location at least. And as you may know, the Andes of Ecuador are famed for high avian diversity, but few long-term studies of bird communities have been completed there, especially in tropical montane forest ecosystems. And since 2004, Dr. Becker has been leading teams of volunteers to conduct annual surveys and mist netting of birds at the reserve. The aim of the expeditions is to record the composition of Andean bird communities in relationship to local habitats and to detect changes related to climate or land use. Over time, consistent monitoring can evaluate the stability and resilience of bird communities, especially in protected areas, and it can help assess the conservation value of particular sites. So the goals of the project. One is to determine patterns of survival in neotropical montane cloud forest birds, to compare avian community composition in various habitats over time and in dry versus wet seasons. So again, it takes place twice a year, in July, which is in the wet season, and December, which is early in the dry season. And to add to our knowledge of neotropical birds in general. Dr. Becker's research contributes to knowledge about breeding seasons, molt patterns, and habitat preferences of Andean bird species, as well as avian responses to local habitat changes. For example, from 2004 to 2010, she and her teams netted birds along an ecotone of well-grazed pastures that were bordered by mature primary forest, which meant there was a hard edge between those two habitats. But in 2011, those pastures were abandoned and second growth gradually recovered in their place. So for a decade, secondary growth forest habitat increased and eliminated that harsh ecotone, that harsh divider, which was a potential barrier for some forest bird species. But then yet another change occurred in part of that area in the late months of 2020, when a local landowner who was a farmer cleared part of that second growth forest and planted naranjilla plants. It's a tropical perennial that grows fruits that are used locally for juice. So by netting over the same areas over time and above and below this changing forest border, Becker expects to detect changes in the composition of the avian community. Okay, just a few quick stats. The reserve is quite small. It's just 126 acres, ranges in elevation from 4,000 feet above sea level to 5,200 feet. As I said, it's on the western slope of the Andes. It's about 3 miles southeast of Mindo, which is located where two of the most biologically diverse ecoregions in the world meet, the Chocó lowlands and the tropical Andes. And to give you an idea of now how popular it's become, according to Wikipedia, 200,000 tourists visit the area annually, 200,000. The reserve, small though it is, extends and buffers a larger reserve that's to the southeast, the Mindo Navío Bosque Protector, or protector forest. And it helps buffer it from expanding agriculture, adventure tourism sites, and holiday home developments, all of which have really boomed in the past decade. So, the habitat. You've got mature tropical montane forest that covers about 75% of the reserve, especially the upper and southeastern sections. In contrast, the lower parts near the research cabin support 3 integrated habitat types: secondary growth forest, riparian mature forest, riparian second growth forest, and pasture. Forested habitats on both sides of the nearby Nambillo River Valley are connected to riparian forest, which facilitates dispersal of birds. So, for example, a forest-dwelling club-winged manakin, which was born on the Las Tangaras Reserve, there's a lek of club-winged manakins, traveled to another reserve 16 kilometers away, likely using the forested corridors along the river. All right, accommodations. And I don't know why there's a little writing on my screen now, but who knows. The accommodations were quite Spartan. So it was a 2-level wooden house, open floor plan. On the lower level, you had a little living room area, dining room area, and then upstairs are sleeping accommodations. We're basically just sleeping bags under mosquito nets. And they were also on the outside of the building on the first level was a porch in the front and the back. There was no Wi-Fi or internet, almost no phone service. You usually had to climb about a half mile up a hill to get to some coverage. The electric power was dependent on a generator, which did go out several times. And there were even occasional water outages when some of the water pipes would get clogged, especially when there was a lot of rain. So it was not luxury travel. So one of the first things we set out to do was to capture birds in mist nets. So it was mist netting. And this was the first time I had ever taken part in that. I'd seen it, but not done it. The first thing you had to do on the first day of mist netting, or the day before we were going to actually capture birds for the first time. On the day before, we hauled the poles and the nets to various locations, actually a number of them up some pretty high hills. And we had to string up the nets and then furl them so nothing would get caught in them overnight. Then we would get up at 5 a.m., dress in the dark, eat breakfast by candlelight, go to the edge of the porch and shake out our boots just in case any spiders had decided to spend the night inside the boots, and that did happen several times. And the spiders could be quite sizable. Then you'd hike to the net locations, still all in the dark, just with your flashlights, and open the nets by 6 a.m. And then from 6 to 11 a.m., we would check the nets at least every 30 minutes. And on particularly cold or wet days, every 20 minutes. So no birds would be kept in the nets too long. We would then extricate any birds that were caught in the nets. And if you hadn't accidentally let the bird escape, which I did twice, although I wasn't the only one, you would then put them in each one in a separate cloth bag. And you would bring it to the banding station. Now, this bird is a red-faced spine-tail. It was actually the only bird I was able to extricate on my own. Extricating birds from the mist nets is really challenging. They can get very tangled. The net filaments are really thin, as they need to be. And it's quite an art, quite a skill and an art to get them out. So I was given some instruction, but I only managed on my own to extricate this little red-faced flying tail. So then you bring the birds back to the banding station. And on the last day in each location, because we would do 2 or 3 days of mist netting in each location, you would then disassemble the nets at the end of your last session and take everything back to the main cabin. The main challenges were rain, 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 and mud, mud, mud. It rained, it was quite unseasonable apparently. It rained almost every day, usually in the afternoon, and sometimes quite heavily, so everything just got progressively muddier. The other main challenge was my big, clumsy, non-dexterous hands. I will never be a professional bird bander or mist netter. Still, despite the challenges, the whole experience of this was so moving. Just as in Costa Rica, the experience of holding a bird in my hand left me in awe and sometimes really on the verge of tears. It was really extraordinary. So after you extricate the birds, you have to band them. So you would have, for any particular bird, you'd have one person handling the bird, examining it, and one person recording the data. And you'd have to start out by recording the net number, which was very important because you needed to know which net it came from, or your data was going to be worth a lot less. You would weigh the bird, and actually it was still in the bag. You weighed in the bag, and then, well, hang on just a moment. So you weigh the bird, still in the bag, then you take the bird out of the bag, and if you haven't let it escape at that point, as I did a couple of times, in fact, one of the birds faked me out. It acted very, very docile while it was in the bag and while I was grabbing it in the right grip. And then once I got it out of the bag and just adjusted my hand, it took off like a shot. And I have to admit, after the momentary frustration, I felt a lot of admiration for the bird's skill. So you'd hand the empty bag to the recorder and they would weigh that. And actually the bag was sometimes not completely empty. Usually there was a little bit of poop in it, but they'd weigh the bag and then you would mark down, you'd have to mark down, was it a newly caught bird or was it a recapture? If it had a band on it, it was a recapture. You'd then try to identify the species, which we were always able to do. You would then try to age and sex the bird using various identifying characteristics. Oops. You then take the bird's measurements. And this is some kind of hermit hummingbird. I can't see exactly which species, but the measurements included measuring the visible part of the bill, called the culmen, the tail, the section of the leg called the tarsus, one of the wings, and then you'd start examining the bird to see whether it's molting, whether it has a brood patch, how much furculum fat it has, this fat on the chest, and whether it has any ectoparasites, and if so, what kinds. And the experienced banders would also examine the cloaca, the all-purpose orifice, to help with sexing and breeding condition. And they'd sometimes also examine the skull to help with aging. And a lot of those examinations involved a lot of blowing on the birds to get the feathers out of the way. And you really had to blow hard. You can get a little dizzy. But this was all, so, I learned to do some of this, but it was all with an expert bander always assisting, or sometimes, especially initially, leading. You then band the bird and record the number of the band. And by the end, I was able to band a bird on my own with one of the expert banders, just observing and continuing to just give advice. And of course, well, then you would take pictures or have someone take pictures. Like in this case, this was a male violet-tailed sylph, an absolutely extraordinary hummingbird that had been caught and banded. And before it was released, we got a picture of it. And then of course you had to release the bird. By the end of the program, we'd collectively captured, examined, banded, and released over 300 birds. And here is me very happy. That was the first bird I helped band. It's a slate-throated red start. They apparently used to be called slate-throated white starts. Now they're slate-throated red starts. And that's me with the second bird I helped band, a gray-breasted wood wren, and that one was really feisty. I was smiling because it was pecking quite energetically at my fingers. Again, I really admired the bird's spirit. So some other activities that were part of our time there. So we also, in between days of surveying in particular locations, we would, of mist netting, we would conduct surveys, bird surveys of different areas, and we'd go out in teams to different areas. And actually, almost at the very end, we got to do the Christmas bird count there at Reserva Las Tangaras, which was really a thrill. There was optional hummingbird trapping and banding, and that was out in front of the cabin. As you can see, there's a hummingbird feeder inside, and you would have this net suspended above it, and there's a string, and once you'd lured in a hummingbird and it got comfortable there, if you pull the string, the net drops down and you've captured the hummingbird. And then the bander would reach in, take it out, and band it. I did not choose to do that part. You also had free time. Some people napped, read. I spent most of my free time birding, usually solo. I got very good at birding in the rain, especially once I discovered that lots of the birds remained active in the rain so long as it wasn't a heavy downpour. We also got one day off in Mindo, and then each evening we would, after dinner, we'd all be around the table, the kitchen table, dining room table, and we would go over La Lista, which was, we had a spiral bound, each had a spiral bound notebook with all of the species that had ever been recorded there at Reserva Las Tangaras. And people, we would call out each one, we'd go down the list, and if anyone had seen it or heard it, mark it down. And it was a lovely, lovely ritual. So one other thing that I got to do, well, the grad student couple who were caretakers and also researchers, one of their jobs every day at 3 o'clock was to monitor for an hour, monitor the 3 hummingbird feeders that were suspended from the porch. And they had to record every species and also the number of each species and the sex, right, if they could determine it. To give you an idea, and they asked, one day they had to go and repair the generator, so they asked if I would do it, and I gladly did. But so you get an idea of what that was like. There were 3 of the feeders, and they were darting all around. On the hour I did it, there were 12 species, including sometimes males and females of each one. So let me just see. Oh, there's something in the chat. Sorry for that up above. Let me just see. Oh, you can hear the sound. Thank you. Oh, I'm so glad. Okay, yeah, and that was monitoring the feeders. All right, on the solo birding, the biggest thrill was usually mixed flocks, where all of a sudden there would be nothing, or only a single bird for, sometimes 15, 20 minutes. I'd be walking along, often in the rain, and then suddenly there'd be a mixed flock of tanagers and wood creepers and on, hummingbirds and a whole bunch of flycatchers. But the one particular thrill that was really reliable was this female flame rumped tanager. When you would walk up this one road and you pass this one spot, she would just dart out of the bank, the foliage from the bank on one side of the road and just shoot across the road and then perch in a tree and vocalize. And just so you see what the male looks like, that's a male. And by the way, neither of these photos are mine, those two. I wish I had gotten good photos of them. But it turned out the reason she was always there was she had a nest with 2 eggs. And so that's a little iPhone photo. And actually, a week after I got back from Ecuador, one of the caretakers sent everybody a little photo that was an update. So she had 2 hatchlings that did quite well. All right. After those 2 weeks of volunteering at Reserva Las Tangaras, I did some recreational birding west and east of the Andes. So I spent 3 days based in Mindo with a local guide and went to 3 different locations, each of which was about an hour away, and then crossed over the Andes and did 2 days with a different local guide in a very different area up, especially we got into very high elevations in the landscape known as the Paramo, which was really gorgeous, and saw completely different birds. And so here come a bunch of the birds. So Trogons, of course, always a thrill. And this little fella from the front and the back is a black-throated Trogon. Also got at a different location, this male looks like the elegant Trogon that we sometimes get here in Arizona, but in fact, he's a masked Trogon. And he actually got quite close. This was at a place called Bay Vista Lodge. And some of the birds there were clearly used to people. So I was actually able to see him for quite a while and hear him. He made a really interesting sound. Of course, lots and lots of tanagers. And they were really, I would say, in some ways, the biggest thrill. They are just gorgeous birds and really varied. So one of the most common was this really beautiful golden tanagers. Also, this species, the rufous-throated tanager, which was one of my favorites. It really has a real delicate beauty. This species, also fairly common, was the golden-naped tanager. You can actually see in the photo on the right that the gold color extends down a little bit. Really, really vibrant and beautiful. This isn't even in the sunlight, and they still glowed even in clouds and drizzle. My favorite tanager, though, was this one. This is the flame-faced tanager, and I could not get over just how gorgeous and how intense the colors were, especially around the face. And I did get to see that sometimes they were fearless at Amagusa Reserve, where they put out fruit at one part in a feeding station. My guide held up that bit of banana relative. It's probably a plantain. Oh no, oh darn. I'll have to try to show that later. He was just basically feeding on the fruit in while the guide held it. Oh dear. I'll see you later if we have time. I'll play that. There were, of course, many hummingbirds. Not a great photo, but that's a female sword-billed hummingbird. And the length of that bill is, I just gasped. And on the right, also not the greatest photo, but again, the bird is fascinating. That's a tawny-bellied hermit. So another hummingbird, when I saw a lot of species, but this species is unlike any I'd seen before. This was on the eastern side, way up high in the Paramo. It's called the shining sunbeam. Now I only saw it from far away, and it was not a sunny day. So although the coloring still I find really, so interesting, because again, I've never seen a hummingbird this particular coloring, but apparently this is what it looks like when you hit it just right. Again, that's not my photo, but you can see why they call it shining sunbeam there. And just now a miscellany of some of the other species that were really striking. Crimson-rumped toucanet, small type of toucan. You don't see the crimson rump there, but when it flew, you definitely saw it. Here's one of my favorites. It's got it not only has a great look, it's got a great name, the tufted tit tyrant. That was also one on the east side, way up high elevation. And this one just posed for the longest time, lots of different, it wanted to be in a photo shoot. This is a white-chinned thistletail. The name actually does make sense, right? The thistletail. I just got photo after photo of it, and it was vocalizing, it was posing, really lovely. A red-breasted meadowlark, and we saw several. In this one you can see, vocalizing in the morning, as meadowlarks are wont to do. And then another really striking bird, a masked flower piercer, and this is the male. And the reason they have this name, flower piercer, is they're nectar thieves. They will pierce down near the bottom of the flower and drink nectar that way, and not get any pollen on them, right? They're not pollinating, they don't enter by the normal route where, say, most of the hummingbirds would. So they're called flower piercers. And there are a number of different species. This was the one that I saw. I think I saw 2 species. This is one I saw most often. Really, really vibrantly colored. And although this bird is not all that fancy, the rufous-bellied seed snipe, this bird was at the highest elevation we got to. It was with the second guide up on the Paramo. We actually drove up as far as you could drive and then hiked up even further up by some radio antenna. And the guide took me up there especially to find this bird. And we walked around for quite a while, not seeing it. And we were just about to turn around back down, and he suddenly said, "Stop." And 5 feet in front of us were a pair of them, feeding very happily and very unconcerned about us. Camouflaged really well, as you can see. And they're only found in that very high location. They're very, very difficult to find, and really, it was so worth that hiking. By the way, the altitude, was challenging. I felt my middle age at numerous times during this trip, but again, always worth it. And finally, the last one, then I'll end the screen sharing. One of the most fascinating birds and strangest. This is the Andean cock of the rock, and this is a male. And actually, there was a lek of cocks of the rock at Reserva Las Tangaras. And on that side of the Andes, the males are red and black and white, a very intense red. On the east side of the Andes, they're this very intense orange. And they really are a strange looking bird. And they make a prehistoric sound. It was, again, quite a thrill. And this was on my last day of birding, so it was very special. I'll repeat the names. I'm going to stop the screen share and I'll tell you the names. Yes, definitely. Okay. So the sharing, I think the screen sharing has stopped, I hope. I can see some of
you can stop sharing your screen.
Great. So Linda, so there was Reserva Las Tangaras, and then I actually did a fair amount just in between, like in the evenings. When I was based in Mindo, I did some birding right around the town because there's some lovely stuff there. But I went to the Amagusa. Let me see if I can put it. So there was the Amagusa Reserve, and then the Rio Silanche Bird Sanctuary, and I'm putting this all in the chat, and Bella Vista Lodge up in the cloud forest, and then Cayembe. I apologize that I can't seem to make accent marks in the chat, but Cayembe Coca Ecological Reserve, also Guango Lodge, which I stayed. That was the only pricey place I stayed. I did one night. The other places I was in hostels, but that one night I splurged, and there was almost no one there because it was the day before Christmas. So I had the place myself with my local guide. So Guango Lodge. Oh, I spelled it wrong. Hang on a moment. And then Papayacta, near the town of Papayacta, and also in a place called Finca San Andres. So those were the locations I was at. And I'll share my email. Anyone, if you want to consult in any way about places to go and guides, I'm more than happy to recommend. My second guide especially was probably the best bird guide I have ever had. He was extraordinary. He grew up in the rainforest, actually, really literally in the Amazon, in a little village that only had several families. And that's where he learned actually most everything just growing up. And then he ended up making, eventually, after a number of different jobs in the city, he made bird guiding his profession. And he's a lovely man, and he was just spectacular. So questions, or what do we have here? Okay, that was a direct one. I'll see that later. Oh, thank you. There were some, I'd say, other lessons. Oh, thank you, Kirsten. I used my camera once I left Reserva Las Tangaras, and I wasn't always being rained on. So, that was great. One of the first bird guide I used was amazing with taking photos through the spotting scope. And my iPhone was much better than his phone. So he began to always ask me, like, here, can I have your phone for a second? And he'd be taking photos. We had to have a talk at one point just about, hey, could I maybe look through the spotting scope for a little while? But to tell you the truth, like, one of the things that was an issue, always something to be aware of, was the economic difference, right? The bird guides are, earning their living, right, doing this, and the people who are using their services. I'm not rich by any means, but compared to the two guides I had, right, I'm far more well off. And you're very aware of it in Ecuador. One place I went that the second guide took me was uh, a little house where a man had set up 3 hummingbird feeders or several hummingbird feeders, and you could go, and for $5 a person, he would serve, bring out some coffee and a few little snacks, and you could just sit there and watch the hummingbirds. And he and his son, his 10-year-old son, loved birds, right? And so when my guide then took me walking nearby, they came along, but they didn't have any binoculars. Binoculars in Ecuador, even a cheap pair, like a pair we would spend $25 for, cost well over $100. And I ended up talking with my guide afterwards to find out more about that. And the mail in Ecuador is terrible. Even sending mail to Quito is really hard. So I ended up buying, a decent pair of binoculars and sending them. It turned out one of the women who owns Guango Lodge was in the US when I got back, and I was able to arrange to send the binoculars to her. And then when she got back, she brought them to him. And, I just felt like it's such a small thing for me, but it could really make such a huge difference in someone's life. And this man and his son were so passionate about birds. Another thing I noticed was also that, we take for granted that changes in names of birds, species get lumped or split, but for the guides, that's a really challenging issue, because they spend a lot of time learning not just to identify sight and sound, but learning these names in English. And then when they change, there needs to be some kind of education and support for guides, so they're not just left to their own with that. So let me see.
And there are a couple of questions in the chat. Yeah, go ahead, David.
Yeah, I see Taylor's. So the guides, the first guide didn't give the bird's name in Spanish. He just wanted to stick to English, but that second guide loved discussing it, and sometimes pointing out the difference in the names and what they might mean, which was, again, something really lovely. And my Spanish was broken conversational Spanish, and they were very patient. But the longer, I stayed, especially with that second guide, he really loved to share that aspect of things. And Kirsten, can you see, were there other questions?
Yeah, so we had another question about the type of camera you used besides your iPhone.
My camera, that camera is a Nikon, I'll have to look the name. It's like, I should have prepared that. The body is not actually all that expensive, but I do have a nice lens. It's a Tamron lens that goes from 150 to 600 millimeters zoom. The thing about the body is it can take, I made sure this time to get a camera that can, you can save raw files as well as JPEGs. So you can do some editing, afterwards, because I am not, truthfully, I'm not really skilled with my camera. I don't use it well. So I often have to go and, fix the exposure, and oh my gosh, the shadows. And I need, if any of you want to, if you're good with a camera and want to give lessons, I need private lessons. And my first camera, the first good camera I ever got when I lived in Oakland was a Nikon, I think it was called the P900, and it had an absolutely extraordinary zoom. It only took JPEG files, so that was a limitation. And I got mugged at gunpoint in my neighborhood during COVID when I was going out every day. So, but never fear, I did have renter's insurance from USAA. So I got most of it back, and I decided to get a camera that used the raw files. And that's really made a big difference, because you actually you can correct for some of your lack of skill if you're me. So.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, David. We have another question from Tina, who asked if it was the dry season when you were there, why was it so rainy? Was that unusual?
It was very unusual. So what was supposedly the norm would have been rain in the afternoon, maybe, every couple of days, every few days, or even if it turned out to be almost every day, just for a little while. And instead, we had really heavy rain almost every day. And in fact, in those 2 weeks, we only had one day without rain. And the researcher, Dr. Becker, Dusty, said this was really, really unusual. And they, there's not enough of a pattern to know what might be the cause. But to get to the reserve, you had to cross this narrow wooden bridge, one person at a time kind of bridge over the river. And by the time we left, that water was getting really close to the bridge. And there was one further down that was no longer, we were not going to be using. It was unnerving to be carrying those poles, mist net poles over that bridge, or because I always overpack like a crazy person, carrying my suitcases on the way out at the end over that bridge with the rushing water beneath. It was intense. So this was an unusual December because usually apparently the wet season will start in November and then December gets drier and then January, the wet season really gets going beyond that.
Wow, that bridge situation sounds like my worst nightmare.
But, sometimes you would see their dippers. And oh my gosh, the ducks, what are they called? There's only one type of duck, the ones that actually swim and dive in the water. They have that one species. So there was a pair of them there that we would see from time to time.
Oh, maybe we can focus on the ducks and less on the, rushing water.
Yeah.
So Nancy would like to know about the cost of hiring a guide in Ecuador.
So, of course it varies. And the way I did, thank you, torrent duck. Yes, thank you, Keith and Jan. So I went on Facebook and I looked around for Ecuador, groups that were about birding in Ecuador. And I posted, questions and, asked if there were guides and anyone had recommendation, and then arranged, one answered and I arranged with him. He was going to be my first guide in Mindo. It turns out, though, he slipped and hurt his back just before I arrived. So it was his brother, who was also a bird guide, who took me around. And for those 3 days with that guide and a friend of his who served as the driver, I think it ended up being about $250. And then with the other guide for those 2 days, where I had then when I crossed the Andes, I rented a car in Quito. It was silly, I shouldn't have done that. Big hassle, but I rented a car, so we had my transportation. So that was $200 for those two days with him, and worth much more. And when you go on a more luxury trip, right, the prices are a lot higher. But yeah, I will say one thing that I did ask my guide, because I had tried to find a woman guide, because the ecotourism industry in a lot of places in Central and South America, it's really been growing, and there have been a lot of resources put into helping develop and support local guides, but it's heavily male. And before the trip, I hadn't been able to find a woman, but my second guide did know several that he thought were great. So in future, I'd be able to recommend to people some women as well.
That all sounds great. I think we answered all the questions in the chat, but we have a couple more minutes. So if anyone wants to either unmute yourself and ask a question or write it in the chat, we can take a couple more.
And I will say, oh, yeah. So I didn't include pictures of the non-avian wildlife. And at Reserva Las Tangaras, there were lots of insects there. You know, again, those spiders, which I kind of kept my distance from. I am an arachnophobe, but there were amazing caterpillars. We got to do a night walk with a herpetologist and saw a whole bunch of frogs, including glass frogs, the ones that are like almost, you know, translucent. Really something else. And butterflies and moths, really gorgeous. Yeah.
Wow, that sounds great. I feel like the ecotourism in Ecuador is about to get a big boost thanks to your presentation, David.
And I have to give a big thank you to Tucson Audubon because, you know, I had arranged this trip, right? Because it was postponed before COVID and I arranged and I paid for it. I mean, the most expensive thing was paying to volunteer at Reserva Las Tangaras because truthfully, you're supporting their research. It's a private, on a shoestring budget operation. And then I got hired by Tucson Audubon, you know, to start work on November 1st. And I had this almost month-long trip, you know, 3 weeks of December. But we talked about it. I talked about it with the interim ED at the time, and she agreed to treat it as professional development. So that was good because I don't know that I could have afforded it if I had also not gotten, you know, any income. But
yeah, that's great. I'm glad you were able to go, and we all get to benefit from hearing about it and seeing your amazing photos.
Oh, well, thank you all for coming. I'm so thrilled. And a little shout out. I see Sam, my climate teacher, Sam Chiriboga, who hooked me up with family in Quito. I got taken around by my friend Sam's, you know, I think these are cousins who were so amazingly generous and wonderful. So I got to see Quito and got to eat, you know, traditional food. And it was actually the annual festival of the city of Quito. So we saw, it was amazing. If you can combine birds and then just some local folks to show you their world, nothing better.
All right. Well, thank you so much, David. And thank you everyone for joining us today. That was a fantastic presentation. It was recorded, so we will get it up on our YouTube page as soon as possible and send out that link to everyone if you want to rewatch or just marvel at those bird photos again. Thank you again, and we hope you have a good rest of your day and a good weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.